The 10 p.m. shift always arrived with the same weight. Not the weight of common tiredness, the kind that any worker carries on their shoulders at the end of a long day. It was another kind of thing, a pressure that began at the back of the neck, descended down the spine, and settled in the chest like a forgotten stone. Dr. Renata Meireles knew that sensation so well that she no longer tried to name it. She simply put on her white coat, tied back her hair, and entered through the automatic doors of the Hospital Municipal da Zona Sul, like someone diving into waters that no longer frighten, only weary. She was 36 years old, with brown hair that hadn't seen a decent cut in almost 5 months, and dark eyes that were once described as the eyes of someone who knows how to listen. On that Tuesday night, while São Paulo poured a fine drizzle over the asphalt and crowded buses crossed Avenida João Dias, those eyes were turned toward the medical record of a 63-year-old gentleman with decompensated heart failure. She read the numbers, adjusted the medication, noted it in the system. Mechanical, precise, present only in the gesture. The mind, however, was elsewhere. It was on the envelope that had arrived the previous week, from the condominium administrator, third notice of late payment of the condominium fee. Below, in red letters that she had read 3 times without being able to completely process, was the deadline before legal referral. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks. The apartment in Jabaquara had been bought with the money left over from her parents' inheritance. It wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, a small balcony overlooking the neighbor's wall, but it was the only place in the world that still belonged to her. Or almost belonged. Because Tiago had passed through there like a well-dressed storm, and the trail he left included a renegotiated loan in her name, a debt with an investment brokerage that she had never consciously contracted, and a shame so deep that she still hadn't managed to tell anyone. Tiago Cavalcante. The name still sounded strange when it appeared in her own thoughts, like a note out of tune. They had been together for 2 years and 8 months. She had abandoned the selection process for the residency in electrophysiology, a highly contested position, years of preparation, because he said he needed her close by at that moment. That projects were being structured, that everything would be different soon. Different it was, only in the direction she had not imagined. When the relationship came to an end, with him disappearing during a weekend and reappearing only to remove his suitcases with a surgical coldness she would never forget, what remained was not just the pain of emotional betrayal. It was the debt, the mortgaged apartment, the interrupted career. And she, who had spent more than a decade building a solid trajectory, waking up at 5 in the morning to study, entire Saturdays in the library, nights on duty without complaining, she was back to square one, only now with interest. Dr. Mirella Santos, the colleague sharing the shift that night, passed through the door of the medical room with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on Renata's desk without asking, without commenting. It was the kind of gesture that only exists between people who have already seen each other crying in a hospital bathroom and decided, by tacit agreement, never to mention it. "ICU transfer for you," said Mirella, looking at the tablet. "Male, 58 years old, supraventricular arrhythmia, already stabilized, but the nursing staff wants your evaluation. I'm going now." Renata took the coffee, drank half of it standing up, and went. The corridor smelled of 70% alcohol and the reheated dinner that someone had forgotten in the break room microwave. She passed a stretcher where a woman slept with her mouth open, past a young father who looked at his cell phone with red eyes. Past all of this without stopping, because stopping was a luxury that a shift did not offer. She evaluated the patient, adjusted the monitor, talked to the family, returned. At 3 in the morning, in the 40-minute interval between one patient and another, she stood still in front of the medical room window, looking at the city that did not sleep. The lights of the avenues, the lamp-posts, the reflection of the drizzle on the roofs. São Paulo never seemed larger than in the early hours of the hospital, when all the noise of the day disappeared and only the real dimension of the thing remained. Millions of people living problems that none of them had chosen. It was there, looking at the city, that Renata made a small decision. Ridiculous, perhaps. After the shift, before sleeping, she would not go directly home. She needed a moment that was only hers, just 1 hour, in a different place, in a place where she wasn't the indebted doctor, the abandoned ex-girlfriend, the professional who had let an opportunity slip through her fingers. Just a moment to be something else, or to be nothing, with dignity. She didn't know yet what that small decision was about to change. The shift ended at 6 in the morning. She went to the locker room, exchanged her white coat for a black knit blouse she kept in her bag for post-work outings, a habit from a time when post-work outings still existed, and went out into the street still wet from the dawn. The sun was beginning to sketch an intention on the horizon, but São Paulo had not yet decided if it accepted the day. She started the car, a 2016 Honda Civic that smelled of vanilla air freshener and had a scratch on the passenger door that she hadn't been able to fix, and went. Without a fixed destination. She just went. She ended up stopping at Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima at 7 in the morning, when the sophisticated bars of that region were starting to close and the bakers were opening their doors. There was a place there that she had passed hundreds of times without entering, the Veranda Alto, with its dark wood facade and amber lights that always looked more like cinema than a bar. It was closing, but the door was still open, and a sign on the side said they served breakfast until 8. She entered. She expected nothing. She expected coffee, maybe bread with butter, maybe silence. She expected only to exist for an hour without anyone asking anything of her. What she did not expect was that, right in the center of the main hall, sitting at one of the tables with a view of the street, would be Tiago, with another woman, smiling, apparently with no weight at all on his shoulders. Renata's stomach turned inside out. She froze at the entrance. He hadn't seen her yet, but it was a matter of seconds. The hall wasn't large, and she was standing in the middle of the way like a person who forgot where she was going. At that exact second, while panic rose in her throat and she was already rehearsing the turn to exit, Tiago raised his eyes and saw. His smile changed. It didn't disappear, it stayed, but it became something else. It became the smile of someone who just found an opportunity they weren't expecting. He stood up from the chair. Tiago's movement toward her lasted perhaps 3 seconds. For Renata, they were 3 whole and complete seconds, with their own texture and weight. She felt the heat rise in her face, her mouth dry, and something that could only be described as primitive shame, the kind that has no logic but is real as a fracture. It wasn't fear of him, technically. It was the specific terror of being seen as small by someone who had already taken so much. It was the anticipated humiliation of hearing him speak with that calm and condescending voice he used when he wanted to demonstrate superiority without raising his voice. It was knowing that in that state, exhausted from the shift, with deep eyes and the knit blouse that hadn't been ironed, she was at a total disadvantage. He took 2 steps. She was paralyzed. And it was exactly at that moment that she made the most impulsive decision of her 36 years of life. To her left, sitting alone on a leather bench near the window, was a man. She had noticed him at a glance upon entering, not on purpose, but because it was hard not to notice. Not for beauty, although he was tall and had a presence that occupied space beyond the physical. It was his stillness, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from relaxation, but from control. Like someone who chose to stay quiet, who could make noise if he wanted to, but decided it wasn't worth it. Renata went to him. It was 4 steps. She put her hand on his shoulder, as if she had known that shoulder for years. "I'm sorry," she said in a low voice with a firmness that surprised herself. "I know what I'm going to ask is absurd, but there is a man coming toward me that I really need not to face right now. Could you pretend you know me?" She expected hesitation. She expected strangeness, a recoil, perhaps a polite no. That was not what happened. The man looked at her. It was a quick look, swept from bottom to top in less than 2 seconds, the kind that catalogues without judgment. Then he did a simple thing. He stood up. When he stood up, Renata understood better why he had caught her attention. It wasn't just the height, 1.90 meters, maybe more. It was the way the body organized itself in space, without visible tension, but without any slackness, like a structure that knows what it can withstand. He put his hand on her back, lightly, just enough to be seen from afar as a gesture of familiarity. "As much time as you need," he said in a low voice. It wasn't a question. Tiago had arrived within 2 meters. He stopped. Renata saw the exact moment when the calculation changed on her ex's face. It wasn't evident fear. Tiago was too controlled for that. It was something more subtle, a re-evaluation. The certainty that there was a new variable in that context that he hadn't considered, and that this variable had broad shoulders and looked at him with the calmness of someone who doesn't need to demonstrate anything. "Renata," said Tiago with his usual smooth voice. "What a coincidence." She took a deep breath. "Hi, Tiago. Are you well?" he asked, and the tone contained that layer she knew so well, the fake concern that was, in truth, an investigation. He wanted to know if she had recovered enough to be ignored or if she was still fragile enough to be managed. Before she could answer, the man beside her spoke. "She is great," he said, without aggressiveness, without volume above what was necessary, only with a conviction that needed no ornament. "And we are late." Tiago looked at the stranger. The stranger returned the look without haste. There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds that Renata felt on the back of her neck, like atmospheric pressure. Tiago retreated. He didn't turn his back immediately. He did that thing of smiling slightly, as if the choice to leave was his. But he retreated. He went back to the table where the woman was waiting for him, and Renata saw him say something in a low voice to her before picking up his jacket from the back of the chair. They left. Renata stood still for a moment with irregular breathing. Then she realized she still had her hand on the stranger's shoulder, or rather, that his hand was still on her back. Gently, she moved away half a step. "Thank you," she said. "I know it was completely out of the ordinary." "It was," he agreed without drama. "But it worked." There was something in his voice. It wasn't a marked accent, but it had a diction that sounded like someone accustomed to choosing words before speaking. Not the kind of care of a lawyer or a politician, more the kind of care of someone who learned that words have weight, and that poorly calculated weight creates trouble. "Do you want to sit?" he asked. "You look like you've been on duty for many hours and we're going to need coffee anyway." Renata blinked. That reading was very precise for a stranger. The white coat had left a mark on the blouse. He indicated her shoulder, where the fold of the fabric had left a clear crease. "And you came to me with the firmness of someone who had no other option. That is not the movement of someone who is rested." She felt a strange warmth in her chest. It wasn't attraction, or wasn't just that. It was the recognition of the feeling of being truly observed. Not evaluated, not measured, not found adequate or inadequate, observed, as a phenomenon that exists and deserves attention. "Renata," she said, extending her hand. "Caio," he replied, shaking it. The hand was firm without being a demonstration. They sat down. The waiter brought coffee without being called. Clearly Caio was someone who frequented that place enough to have anticipated orders. Renata hugged the cup with both hands and stayed looking at the avenue outside, where the São Paulo day had finally decided to begin in earnest. "He did something to you," said Caio. It wasn't a question. "It's a long story," she replied. "You don't have to tell it." "I know." She took a sip of the coffee. "But strangely, I feel like telling it to someone who doesn't know me, someone who won't look at me with pity afterward." Caio leaned his elbows on the table and looked at her with that attention she had already noticed was his trademark. "Then tell it," he said. "I don't do pity easily." And she, who hadn't told the complete story to anyone, not even to Mirella, nor to her sister who lived in Campinas, nor to the psychologist she had abandoned in the 3rd month because she couldn't afford the sessions, she began to tell. She didn't know yet that that quiet and attentive man, sitting before her with the coffee getting cold, carried a whole world that she could barely imagine. She didn't know what he was capable of doing, nor what he was willing to do. She didn't know that that early morning conversation in a bar in Itaim Bibi was in many ways the real beginning of a story that the two were still about to live. For now there was only the coffee, the avenue waking up outside, and the strange lightness of being heard by someone who owed her nothing and expected nothing in return. She told it in parts, not in a linear way. It came out as it usually comes out when someone finally speaks about something that has been dammed up for too long, in leaps, with holes in the middle, with regressions. She told about the beginning with Tiago, the slow seduction of a man who knew exactly what to say and when to say it. She told about the projects he promised, and that never materialized, but that always seemed to be about to come to fruition. She told about the abandoned residency, the specialization opportunity she had prepared for over 4 years and let go in a night of low conversation and arguments that seemed reasonable at the time. Kaio listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't tilt his head at the calculated angle of someone demonstrating performative empathy. He just stayed there, with his eyes on her, present in a way she couldn't quite define, but that was different from everything she had experienced. "And the money," she said when she reached that part of the story, with her gaze lowering to the coffee. "He opened a joint account without me really understanding what I was signing. He said it was for a real estate investment. Then he transferred the balance to a company that no longer existed. He also took the amount I had invested separately. It was the savings I had kept since my residency. 10 years of care." There was a pause. "How much?" asked Kaio, direct, without softening it. She appreciated that. The direct question without the pious beating around the bush. 140,000 reais, between what he withdrew and the financing I took on in my name, without completely realizing what I was doing. Kaio didn't whistle, didn't raise his eyebrows, didn't say, "Wow." He stayed quiet for 2 seconds. "And did you try through legal means?" "I tried. A lawyer told me it was difficult to prove intent without documentation tying the transfers to his intention, that it would take years, and that the costs would probably exceed what I could recover." She took a sip of the coffee, which was already cold. "He is smart. He left everything at the limit of what is hard to prove." "And the apartment?" "I have 3 weeks before the condominium refers it for judicial collection. The financing is in arrears. I'm paying what I can with the shifts, but it hasn't been enough." She said this in a flat way, like someone reading a diagnosis aloud. It was the only way she had found to talk about it without collapsing. Kaio stayed looking at her for a moment. "Why did you tell me this?" The question caught her slightly by surprise. She thought honestly before answering. "Because you said you weren't going to have pity, and you didn't." She almost smiled. "And because you are a stranger. Strangers are safer sometimes." "Sometimes," he agreed. They stayed in silence for a moment. Outside, São Paulo had already entered full daytime mode. The traffic on Faria Lima grew in volume, and the drizzle had given way to a hesitant sun that hit the glass facade of the bar with copper light. "You will resolve it," said Kaio finally. "Not as a consolation, as a technical statement." "You don't know that?" "No. But you are a doctor. You woke up early to work, and even so you went to the shift without failing. You are not the type of person who fails to resolve what needs to be resolved." She looked at him for a longer moment. "Do you always do this? Analyze people you just met?" "Only when I think it's worth the effort." There was something in that answer that she didn't immediately know how to interpret. It wasn't a pickup line. It didn't have the clumsy weight of a man trying to impress. It was a simple statement, delivered with the same naturalness as everything he had said until then. Like someone who didn't need to build an improved version of himself for each new person he met. She asked for another coffee. He didn't ask. He just looked at the waiter who brought it without a word of command. That, she noted mentally, the way the space responded to him without him needing to demand it. "What do you do?" she asked. The first real change in his expression happened there. It wasn't discomfort. It was something more like the pause of someone deciding in real time how much they will reveal. "I solve problems," he said. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that people don't know how to solve through normal paths." She waited for more. He didn't add anything. "That is vague enough to fit a lot of things," she said. "Yes." "You won't elaborate?" "Not now." There was a direct honesty in this refusal that she strangely respected. He didn't invent a generic profession, didn't deflect with humor, didn't pretend the question hadn't been asked. He said not now, and there was something in that expression that made it clear there was an implicit "for now" in it, that the no was circumstantial, not definitive. At 8:30 in the morning, when the bar announced it would close for lunch preparation, they went out together to the sidewalk. The sun had finally decided and beat strongly on the still damp asphalt, creating that specific reflection of São Paulo after the drizzle, a luminosity that seems to come from below, from inside the city. Caio took his cell phone out of his pocket and handed it to her. "Put your number." She stayed looking at the device for a second. It was a simple and direct gesture that had no performance of conquest. It was the gesture of someone who decided they wanted to continue having access to another person and was being honest about it. She typed the number and handed it back. "I know nothing about you," she said. "I know." He put away the cell phone. "But you know enough to know that I won't show up asking for anything." She thought about that while she went to the car, opened the door, put on the seatbelt. She thought about it on the way home in Jabaquara, while the city passed through the window in all its noisy and indifferent complexity. She thought about it while she went up the stairs of the condominium, entered the apartment, threw her shoes near the door, and stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the place she was about to lose. He had said he wouldn't show up asking for anything, and she, who had learned with much pain to distrust anything that seemed too good, discovered that she didn't distrust that. She didn't know exactly why. Maybe because he hadn't tried to seem good. He had just been what he was, whatever that was, without effort to mold his own image according to what she needed to see. She lay on the bed without taking off her clothes and slept without dreaming. The first truly rested night in months, without her knowing for sure why. At the same time, on the other side of the city, Caio Drummond sat in a black leather chair in an office on the 12th floor of a discreet building in Chácara Santo Antonio. He opened a notebook, typed a name, Tiago Cavalcante. He began to read. In the following 10 days, Renata lived on the surface of things. Shifts, medical records, machine coffee, the envelope from the administrator that she had placed on top of the refrigerator and stopped looking at because looking didn't help. Mirella had noticed that something had changed, not for the worse, which confused her, and kept sending check-in messages with octopus emojis, which was the code between them for, "I'm here if you need me, but I won't ask anything." Caio had sent a message 2 days after the meeting. Short. "How are you?" Without a question mark, which she had found interesting, as if conventional punctuation were a formality he saw no need to fulfill. She had responded with honesty. "Tired, but well. Thank you for the coffee and for the rescue." He had responded with a single word. Unnecessary. She stayed looking at that word for longer than she should. She didn't know if he was saying the thank you was unnecessary or that the rescue had been too simple to deserve recognition. She concluded it was probably both things at the same time. On the 11th day at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, when the São Paulo sky was the color of old lead, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered by reflex as someone who is a doctor and answers everything. "Renata Meireles." It was a female voice, formal, with the office tone she immediately associated with collections or medical bureaucracy. "Yes, this is Marina Salave, from Salave and Associados. I am contacting you regarding the financial situation linked to your CPF, specifically the real estate financing in arrears and the pending issues at the Integral Invest brokerage." Renata closed her eyes. "I know about the pending issues," she said. "Yes, but perhaps you do not know about a recent update." A calculated pause. "Mr. Tiago Cavalcante made a full deposit of 142,000 reais into your account earlier this week, explicitly referencing the previous transfers. The amount covers the financing in arrears, settles the debt with the brokerage, and still leaves a considerable balance. Our role is to confirm that you received it and guide you on the next legal steps to formalize the settlement." The silence that followed was different from all the silences Renata had known. It wasn't the silence of despair, nor that of simple relief. It was the silence of when something impossible happens and the brain needs an extra instant to accept that the coordinates of the real world have changed. "Repeat the amount," she said with her voice carefully controlled. The woman repeated it. The number was the same. Renata hung up the phone, went to the bathroom, opened the sink faucet, and stayed with her hands under the cold water for almost a minute. Then she went to her cell phone and opened the conversation with Caio. "You did something." The response took 3 minutes. "What do you mean?" "Tiago. The money." This time the response took longer. 7 minutes. When it arrived, it was different from the short pattern he had established. He made a decision. Circumstances may have influenced that decision, but the money was always yours. She read that 3 times. There was an almost legal precision in those phrases that she recognized as deliberate. He had chosen each word in a way that didn't explicitly say what he had done, but also didn't deny it, like someone who knew exactly where the line was. I didn't ask for this. I know. Why? The response this time took 12 minutes. She stood in the kitchen looking at the administrator's envelope on top of the refrigerator, waiting. Because it was the correct thing. She stayed with the cell phone in her hand for a long moment. Then she typed, "Can I call you?" "You can," she called. He answered on the second ring. "I need to understand what happened," she said, without preamble. "I talked to him," replied Caio with the same calm voice as always. "I showed that there was a difference between what he had done and what could become documentable. He preferred to regularize the situation voluntarily." "How did you get that documentation? I have access to information that most people don't have." A pause. "I didn't enter anywhere I shouldn't be. I didn't do anything you need to worry about. But you did something I didn't ask for." "I did," he confirmed without deflection. "This bothers me," she said. "I know, that's why I'm explaining." She went to the living room window. Down there, the street in Jabakura was in its nocturnal rhythm, the bar on the corner with tables outside, the residents passing with grocery bags, the newsstand closing its shutters. "Who are you, Caio?" The question was larger than the previous one. She had asked what he did. Now she was asking something else. "I am someone who works on solving problems that depend on access, information and negotiation," he said. "I work with people and companies that need to resolve situations that conventional processes do not resolve well. I do not harm those who did not harm first. I do not do things that I cannot look at frontally in the mirror afterward. And Tiago? Tiago harmed first. A lot." There was something in his voice in this last sentence that was different. It wasn't anger. It was close to anger, but controlled. As if the anger existed, but had been placed in a specific compartment so as not to hinder the function. "You have known me for 11 days, she said. "Yes." "Why did you care?" The pause this time was short, only 1 second. "Because you came to me without hesitation, with enormous fear, and even so you didn't ask for more than you needed. You asked for just enough. People who ask for just enough are rare." Renata stayed looking at the street for a longer moment. "I'm going to need you to tell me more," she said finally. "Not now, but eventually. If this is going to continue being something." "Fair. And I'm going to need you not to make decisions about my life without asking first." "Also fair," he said, and there was in his voice something that she identified after a moment as respect, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. She hung up the phone. She stood still for another instant. Then she went to the refrigerator, took the administrator's envelope, opened it, and this time read it to the end without feeling the stone in her chest. She could pay. She could resolve it. She could breathe. For the first time in a year, the apartment felt like a place she had chosen to be, instead of a place from which she was about to be expelled. And with that relief came also the clarity that there was a larger conversation ahead, with a man she barely knew and who had done something huge without asking for credit, and that this was only the beginning of something that didn't yet have a name. The selection process for the residency in cardiac electrophysiology opened spots twice a year. Renata knew this by heart. She had followed the calendar for years, timed every stage, dreamed of the day when she would have enough financial stability to try again. Now, with the debt settled and a balance she still barely believed existed, that day had arrived sooner than she had calculated to be possible. She signed up on a Saturday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the form open on her laptop and the coffee forgetting to cool down beside her. She placed the cursor over the confirmation button and stood still for 30 seconds. It was a gesture both simple and immense at the same time. It was saying that she was coming back, that it wasn't over, that the interregnum had been long, painful, but not definitive. She clicked, and then, almost as if the day needed to offer balance, the phone rang. It was Caio. "How are you?" The usual question, without a question mark, even in the audio. "I signed up for the residency selection," she said. And she realized, while speaking, that she was smiling, not a broad photograph smile, the discreet kind that happens when the body notices something before the mind can name it. "When was that?" "Now, about 2 minutes ago." A pause. Then, "Can I invite you to dinner?" She blinked. The question was direct, without adornment, like everything that came from him. It hadn't been wrapped in "when you have time" or "if you're not too tired." It was an invitation that didn't apologize for existing. "You can," she replied. They met at a restaurant in Itaim Bibi, 2 blocks from Veranda Alto, where everything had begun. It wasn't the same place. It was smaller, quieter, with exposed brick walls and a wine list that Caio navigated without looking at the price. Not out of ostentation, she realized. It was simply that kind of concern was not on his radar. Sitting at the table, there was something different between them. It wasn't the first time they saw each other, but it was the first time they saw each other intentionally. Without the pretext of help, without the adrenaline of the bar, without the exhaustion of a shift that had given the previous conversation a quality of confession. Now they were there, 2 adults, at a dinner that both knew was not completely neutral. "Tell me about electrophysiology," he said. She raised her eyebrow. "Do you want to know for real? You're going to spend the next few years on this." "Yes, I want to know for real." She spoke. She explained the specialty, the electrical mechanisms of the heart, that she found so fascinating they were almost poetry. The rhythm that when unregulated can kill in minutes, and that when restored is almost miraculous. She told about ablations, 3-dimensional mappings of the heart, the necessary precision that was different from any other area of medicine. He listened. He asked intelligent questions, not the questions of educated laypeople who pretend to understand to please. They were questions that showed he was processing what she said and wanting to go deeper. "Have you always wanted this specialty?" he asked. "Since medical school." She spun the wineglass between her fingers. "There is a professor, Dr. Alcantara, who gave a lecture on complex arrhythmias in the 5th year that changed the way I thought about the heart, about the body, about what medicine can do." "And is he still at the university?" He is one of the names in the selection process I signed up for today." Caio stayed looking at her with that attention she had already learned to recognize as his way of being completely present. "Then you will be approved," he said. "You can't know that. I know you will prepare as if the spot were the last in the world, and that is usually enough," she laughed. It was a small laugh, but it was real. It was during dinner that he began to talk about himself. Not continuously. It came in fragments, like someone distributing information with cost consciousness. She learned that he had grown up in Santo André, the son of an accountant father and a Portuguese teacher mother, that he had started his career in a private security company, then migrated to what he called strategic consultancy in high-complexity situations, that he had set up a small team of 5 people, each with a different type of knowledge, and that he worked exclusively by referral. "You never told me the name of the company," she observed. "I don't have a company with a market name. Clients arrive by reference." He paused. "Is it important for you to know the name?" she thought. "It's important for me to understand what you deal with. Specifically, asset recovery negotiations, resolution of conflicts between parties who prefer not to involve the judiciary for various reasons, background investigation, protection of people in situations of vulnerability. That last one seems different from the others. It's what I choose to do when I decide it's worth it," he said, and her look was enough for him to understand that this was the category she had entered. She didn't look away. "Isn't that dangerous?" "Sometimes." "And aren't you afraid?" "I am, but fear is information, not instruction." She kept that phrase in her head for the rest of the dinner. Fear is information, not instruction. It was a distinction she had tried to make in her own life without being able to articulate it. They left the restaurant at 11 p.m. The street was fresh with the kind of wind that São Paulo sometimes offers in May, surprising and clean. He walked with her to the car. On the sidewalk there was an instant of pause that both noticed. He didn't move closer beyond where he was. He didn't force anything. "Next week," he said. It wasn't a question, but there was room for denial. "Next week," she confirmed. On the way home, she couldn't stop thinking about something she had noticed during dinner. The way he looked at her, not as a problem to solve, not as someone who needed help, not as a woman he had rescued. He looked at her as someone interesting, as someone whose existence he thought was worth the attention. There was a difference between being seen and being recognized. Tiago had catalogued what he could extract and acted from that. Caio hadn't asked questions about what she had. He had asked questions about what she thought. There is a huge distance between those two things. She arrived at the apartment, closed the door and stood for an instant in the living room, listening to São Paulo outside. There was much to study, much to remember, much to recover in the coming weeks, and she was, for the first time in a long time, anxious in a way that didn't hurt. She thought about calling her sister in Campinas before sleeping. She considered the conversation, what she would have to explain, the inevitable questions about who this man was and where he had appeared from. She decided not yet. There were things that needed more shape before being put into words for someone who had known her forever, and who would look at everything through the just and worried lens of someone who saw what Tiago had done. It was a risk she understood, and she needed to carry that lens too, but there was something between necessary vigilance and total closure, a zone where it was possible to be attentive without being armored. Caio had been honest about what he couldn't say. He had been honest about the risks. He had returned what was hers without asking for anything in return. That didn't resolve everything, but it was a different starting point than she had had before. She went to sleep with the study material open on the kitchen table, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without waking up in the middle of the night with a racing heart. She stayed looking at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of that conversation settle. There was still a lot uncertain. His world was complex, and she didn't know all its contours. But there was a man there who had reached her without asking for anything, who admitted his own mistakes without deflection, and who looked at her now without artifice. It was, at the very least, a different starting point from everything she had known before. 1 year and 3 days after the morning, Renata Mireles had entered Veranda Alto expecting nothing, and leaving with the number of a stranger and the first deep breath in months, she returned to the same place. It was a Thursday morning. The São Paulo of that October had a clear and dry sun that made the Faria Lima buildings sharper than usual, and she had arrived early because she had learned in that last year that arriving early was the gentlest way to respect what matters. Veranda Alto had gone through a light renovation. The wood on the facade was lighter, and there was a new plant near the entrance she didn't recognize by name, but that she thought was beautiful. Caio was already there, in the same position he was in when she had found him the first time, on the leather bench near the window, with the coffee in front of him. The waiter who knew him had brought it without asking, and there was a second cup on the other side of the table. She sat down, took the coffee. They stayed in silence for a moment, looking at the avenue that began the day with its habitual density. 1 year, she said. 1 year and 3 days, he corrected. You counted. I count. There was something in that response that still caught her. Not for being romantic. Caio was not given to surface romanticism. It was for the precision. He had counted because the day mattered to him enough to be counted. It was a subtle difference she had learned to recognize as his own language. The residency was halfway through. It was brutal as she had predicted. Long shifts, constant learning, nights when she arrived home and couldn't do more than take off her shoes and lie sideways on the bed. But there was something completely different from the tiredness from before. The tiredness from before was from wear and tear, from a life that was being led by forces that were not hers. The current tiredness was from construction. It was the kind that hurts well. Dr. Alcantara had become a kind of reference figure for her, not a mentor in the formal sense, but the kind of professional whose presence in a hospital corridor changes the temperature of the conversation. He had commented in a mid-module feedback that she had an instinct for the difficult diagnosis, and patience for the patient no one else knows how to listen to. She had kept those words with the care she reserved for things that were true. There is one thing I want to ask you, said Caio after a moment. She looked at him. There was something different about him, not nervousness. He was not given to that, at least not visibly. It was a quality of more full attention than usual, if that was possible. "You can," she said. He placed something on the table. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was the same gesture as placing a cup, functional and direct. It was a small object, in a simple grey velvet package. She stayed looking at it. "I don't have a prepared speech," said Caio, "and you know me well enough to know that a prepared speech would be less honest than what I am going to say without preparation." A pause. "I don't know everything that is going to happen. The world I inhabit has complications that are not going to completely disappear. You are going to have a demanding career that will ask a lot of you in the coming years. Neither of the two is in a position to promise a simple life." She stayed very quiet. "What I can promise," he continued, "is that you will never feel small by my side, that when I err, I will say, 'I erred,' that I will ask you before making decisions that are yours." A longer pause. "And that I think you are the most interesting person I have found in a long time, and that I don't want to stop finding you." She stayed looking at the velvet box. Then she looked at him. "That was the most honest proposal I have ever received. It's the only one I know how to make." She took the box, opened it. It was a simple ring, gold with a single small diamond. Nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed. It was the kind of thing that would look good on the finger of a doctor who washed her hands 40 times a day. "You thought about the practical part," she said. "I always think." She placed the ring on her finger. She stayed looking at it for a moment. There was an entire year between that morning and this one, a year of debts settled, of a spot won, of honest conversations and admitted errors and established limits and respect built brick by brick. There was the Jabaquara apartment that now smelled of her truly, without a trace of anyone else. There was Caio's mother and her garden and her words about a straight spine. There were shifts and spaghetti with garlic and oil, and the phrase about fear as information that had become hers too. It was a life, imperfect, complex, still under construction, but completely hers. "Yes," she said, direct, without ornament, as he had taught her without knowing he was teaching. Outside, São Paulo followed without stopping, indifferent and magnificent. Faria Lima full of people who had stories as complex as hers, going from one place to another with the characteristic haste of those who live in a city that never learns to stay still. And inside Veranda Alto, with the coffee cooling and the October light entering through the window, two adults who had reached themselves through difficult and different paths sat side by side, needing nothing more than what they had. End of story. If the story of Renata and Caio touched something in you, if at any moment you felt your heart tighten or took a deep breath, or wanted that moment on the Itime Bibi sidewalk to last a little longer, then this story fulfilled what it came to do. Here on the channel, every week we bring narratives like this, stories of real people in intense situations, full of turns, of courage, of restarts that no one saw coming. If you haven't subscribed yet, the button is there waiting for you. And each subscription is a way of saying that stories like this matter. Leave your like as well, because it tells us that the night of recording and each word chosen with care was worth it. And in the comments, tell us, what was the moment that most gripped you? Which phrase stayed with you? We read everything. We'll see you in the next story.